Archive Discourse, Public-Private, Violence and Peacemaking. All three books have benefited from engagement with the Foundation and its archival resources. As we take the time to reflect on the complexity of our histories, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the 21st anniversary of the establishment of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. It is indeed appropriate that we use this particular dialogue to mark this event, as we continue to be guided by our renewed mandate that calls on us to promote social justice through the memory dialogue nexus. At this time, I'd like to hand over to our facilitator for this afternoon, who will introduce our panelists and guide us through the conversation. Professor Vern Harris is the Head of Leadership and Knowledge Development at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and also holds a professorship at the Nelson Mandela University. He's an archivist in his own right and has worked extensively with Datu Madiba. Please do follow the conversation on our social media platforms using the hashtag Liberate Archive. Ntate Vern, ke a leboga.
Thank you, Sylvia Ngiyabonga. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. And I was really delighted to see so many familiar names when I looked at the registration list. It's a real pleasure to be facilitating such a distinguished panel. All three of our speakers are respected scholars and public intellectuals. They hardly need introduction, but let me very briefly do that introduction, starting with Carolyn Hamilton, who is a professor at the University of Cape Town, who has mentored generations of young scholars and activists and has contributed incredibly to institution building, including at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. So currently she is one of our trustees. I should pause and just acknowledge that also with us this afternoon, well, certainly she registered Leslie Cowling, who is co-editor of the book, Babel Unbound. Leslie, if you're with us listening, let me say congratulations from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, great job. Then Jacob Dlamini, who is teaching history at Princeton University. Please come home one day, brah. He's the author of two books, Native Nostalgia and Askari, which were timely provocations, important books. And I think this third book is going to be as well. And then Imran Kuvadia, like Carolyn, also a professor at University of Cape Town. He's a successful novelist, social commentator, and a robust participant in public discourse. So we have a great panel, and we have three really important books to be paying attention to. Before I hand over to the panelists, and I've asked each of them to kick off with 10 to 15 minute input speaking to their books. Before I hand over to them, I want to add one layer of framing to what Sylvia offered us. A couple of months ago, I and a few of my colleagues found ourselves reading these three books more or less simultaneously. What struck me was the extent to which common threads ran across these three very different books, threads which the Nelson Mandela Foundation has been working with for some time. And I just want to name what, for me, as we go into the discussion, are the most urgent lines of inquiry, critical questions, which all three books address, and which potentially for the Nelson Mandela Foundation, we will benefit most from in terms of the discussion. So 3 questions, I'm just naming them. The first one is, what is the mooring of non-violence as a practice, as a strategy, as a mode of public deliberation? What is its mooring in contexts where structural violence is overwhelming? And this is a question we've been wrestling with since 2016, 2017, when we were doing mediation work on campuses during Fees Must Fall. Second question, not unrelated to the first one. Is the social contract which underpins South Africa's constitution, and which indeed underpins democracy as an apparatus generally, is that social contract working? Is it time to begin reimagining the social contract? And then thirdly, what is the impact on public discourse? What is the impact indeed on the work of building democracy, of the absence, the hiding, the suppression, the disavowal of huge swathes of archive? So, for example, the Apartheid Security Archive. And Jacob, of course, with his book is focusing very much on that archive. And he'll perhaps share with us some of his challenges in even accessing the records that he relied on for the book. Another one is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission archive. I don't want to give you a long list, but another one, a disavowed archive, one that is, for us at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, we've been wrestling with this for a couple of years now, so critical, is, and I'm using inverted commas here, the pre-colonial archive, the indigenous archive. How would our democracy be functioning differently if that archive were woven into the warp and woof of public space? But enough from me. It's just wonderful to be able to sit back now and listen to 3 inputs, and I'm going to ask Carolyn to go first.
Thanks very much. Thanks to the Nelson Mandela Foundation for inviting me to participate in such an extraordinary lineup of books. And I thought I'd use part of my time today to introduce Babel Unbound, so that those of you who haven't had a chance to read it will at least have some sense of what the book is about and the positions it puts forward on things like public discourse, the state of public deliberation in relation to the operations of democracy, the role of established and new media, and of central importance to today's discussion, the relationship between archive and public discourse. And I'm going to do this by quickly mapping the structure of the book for you, and then I'm going to make a few points about archive and public discourse specifically, and I'll try to pick up a little bit perhaps on some of the framing remarks. So to kick off, I want to read the opening sentence of the book. It has been an article of faith in modern societies that in order to live together, we need to talk to one another. The premise is that through dialogue, communities can mediate different needs, solve pressing problems, decide on leaders, and come to consensus on issues that confront collective life. And we go on to say, the extent of the failures in how we mediate collective life shows how crucial it is to understanding the workings of the taken for granted processes of public engagement in all their multiple and sometimes unrecognized forms. Now, as you all know, all too well, there's been a great deal of comment, a flurry of research on social media practices, fake news, internet-based political interference, and how all of this fuels populist movements. But this book takes a step back from concerns about current social media ills and their political effects to examine critically the underlying dynamics of public engagement, both now and over a longer stretch of history. So part of what the book does is to theorize public life and the relationship between three things: public discourse, media, and archive. And it does this in ways that are rather different from the ways they have long been theorized in Europe and America. It does this on the back of insights drawn from sharply etched African and South African conditions in particular, suggesting that these theorizations are not simply pertinent to African situations, but may well constitute a helpful set of other universals with much wider than Africa-wide application. Now, when we submitted that book manuscript to the press in 2017, this claim seemed a bit bold. After the events of 2020, it seems obvious. So I'm now going to share my screen so that you can see the table of contents. And I'm going to use the table of contents to provide a map of the structure of the book. The introduction and chapter 1 offer fresh theorization of public deliberation. And we show how the public sphere, the central social imaginary of democracy, and hold on to that phrase, central social imaginary of democracy, has been convened, corralled, and even captured, and how deliberation can better be understood as operating in what we term capillaries of debate, a shifting web of connections in which ideas are constantly circulating. The second chapter looks at how public engagements gather potency and lose potency, how ideas travel, gaining and losing force. Now, interestingly, that chapter is now already being used in research projects to track how ideas travel in public life. Chapters 3 and 4 look at, respectively, the established media and new media, at how public debate is shaped by long-established newsroom routines and processes, and by fluid ebbs and flows of publicness. Chapter 5 examines Mandela as the Black Pimpernel in the early 1960s. The Pimpernel's presence of absence, we know is there even though we do not see him, offers a theoretical foundation for understanding how the presence of absence, hold on to that phrase as well, has moved issues of race, racism, and Blackness into the heart of contemporary public deliberation. And I guess nowhere is that more vividly seen this year than in the issues around Black Lives Matter. Chapter 6 then teases out and develops the archival threads that are present in those earlier chapters, specifically looking at the way in which archives and evidentiary records, even the very most recent of records, are positioned as arbiters of truth and facts in public debate, even when they are absent. Now, this chapter is perhaps the one most central to the concerns of today's discussion. It's probably the reason why I'm the person representing the book today. I was the writer of it. Now, when I've finished mapping out the book, I'm going to come back to this chapter to draw out as clearly as I can what the chapter has to say about the relationship between archive and public discourse. But for the moment, I want simply to say that the core of the argument presented here is that archive, far from being a static place that we go to for material to support public discussion, is always both a maker of and made by public discourse in an ongoing, dynamic, mutually shaping and reshaping relationship across time. Now, what follows in the second half of the book is a series of essays on particular topics that utilize or elaborate on the theoretical and methodological points of the first half of the book. So there's a chapter that takes a long historical look at the role of the Timbuktu archive and their role it's played in public discourse from the 14th century onwards, coming to occupy a particular place in the 21st century. The next chapter deals with the sequestered public sphere of migrant politics, wholly unrecognized in the multiple attempts by media and academics to make sense of the 2012 Marikana uprising. The chapter on outrage in the 2015-16 Roads Must Fall protests focuses on the archive that art collections, statutory and colonnaded buildings make central, and on how the university's established way of debating disabled meaningful critical deliberation on these issues, at least before the protests erupted. While the final chapter foregrounds the way in which many contemporary debates are primarily a battle over regimes of truth and regimes of the sayable. Now, books have a long lead time before they appear in print. And when we put these chapters together, these issues were a strong feature of South African public life. But in 2020, they've erupted forcefully everywhere. We can see in so many of the 2020 eruptions that the relationship between archive and public discourse is increasingly recognized as the problem, that in various ways, various people recognize the two things often to be out of sync with each other. And the most straightforward sign of this is when the statues of slavers are pulled down. So now I'm going to go back to the argument about archive and public discourse that I make in the middle of the book. And I'll start by focusing not on the contents of any archive, but on the concept of archive itself. And I'll condense the essence of what I want to say here through reference to the title of today's webinar, Liberating the Archive. Some of us will think of that as something like opening access to archives, making papers available, finding new archives, rereading archives against the grain or along the grain or in relation to other archives so as to achieve new ways of understanding the past. All of these things are important, and we'll surely be discussing many of them today. But that chapter in the middle of Babel Unbound suggests we may want to liberate ourselves from a particular concept of archive itself. It is, I would suggest, a very 19th century concept coming out of Europe. The archive is a cloistered space where stuff is packed away and safely stored, protected against the forces of change. A place where records, mostly by design, but sometimes by accident, get deposited and remain essentially untouched and preserved, as best the professional competence of archivists can achieve. And in many senses, this is the case, but in many other senses, the chapter suggests it's not. And in that chapter, I use 3 case studies to demonstrate how archives are forged and changed over time through engagement in political and public life and through academic engagement, and in turn, how archives shape and change political, public, and academic practices and discourses. Now, perhaps the easiest way to get our heads around this is to think of archives and discourses as being involved in a mutually constituting spiral across time. And I've got that Nelson Mandela Foundation spiral right there in front of me. So apartheid discourses in the 1960s famously shaped the Mandela prison record, managed assiduously by the security establishment. But what Mandela wrote in his various prison letters, and even what he did not write, in turn shaped those discourses over time, with both the discourses and the archive changing across time, each in response to the other. And you all probably know well the stories of letters destroyed and letters found, letters stolen and recovered, with changes in discourses and practices precipitating changes in the record itself, and the record precipitating changes in discourse across the sweep of time. And it's yet ongoing as we speak, as public discourse critical of Mandela calls attention to and even produces new archives in new places. So going beyond questions of the bias or otherwise of archives, and recognizing archives and public discourse as mutually constitutive over time, the chapter takes a position in relation to heated contemporary debates about the role of archives in public life. At the heart of that position is the giving of attention to the operations of power in and around archives and public debate. Now, that power of archives is perhaps most simply and clearly revealed when they are expensively established and maintained, or when they're deliberately destroyed, something which happens regularly through human history. Moments of destruction are dramatic, visible moments of public engagement and archival dynamism. But actually, as the case studies that I discussed show, archives are constantly being tinkered with and aligned with shifting public discourses. A recognition of how archives and public discourses are interlinked in processes of change across time does not signal the end of archives, as some would have it, notably those who worry that challenges to the authority of existing archives signal the end of the pursuit of truth. Rather, archives understood as particular kinds of productions that have changed and continue to change in response to changing conditions are not failed sources of evidence. They have much to offer if we understand and grapple with their changing role in changing public life. To recognize this point is to be ready for debate in which evidence does count, in fact, is critical to serious discussion of any matter. However, such evidence is not a factual nugget mined from the archive, but a piece of evidence considered in relation to its own biography. This is, I think, a task that Jacob undertakes with the Terrorist album in an exemplary fashion. Now, to fail to recognize this is to put archives in the public position where they are the arbiters of what is and is not knowledge, rather than to understand them as subject to public and political pressures and changes, as well as themselves agents in precipitating changes. To fail to recognize this, and I say this in the final sentence of the chapter, is to make the archive vulnerable to immolation. That's why so many archives are on fire. And it's to fan the fires of fake news. I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Fer.
Thank you, Carolyn. Wow, you've given us lots to chew on. I just want to alert people who are participating that if you want to pose questions to the panel, if you want to respond, just comment as we go along. Please use the chat function to do that. And as far as possible, panelists will be picking up on those inputs. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Jacob.
Thank you, Vern. So thank you, Sylvia. Thanks to the Mandela Foundation for putting this discussion together, and thanks to all of you who are tuning in. So I'm going to try and make 3 points that, in some ways, I think build on what Carolyn has just given us. A very generative and very productive, opening. And the first point that I want to make is in some ways a response to the title of today's discussion, Liberating the Archive. And I want to make the point that there is, I think, at one level, an injunction for us to take the title literally, right? To think of ways of liberating the archive in order to, I guess, force ourselves as South Africans to see South Africa as it is, not as we would like it to be. And this may sound counterintuitive, given our commitment to social justice, given what we're trying to do, to redress, past wrongs, etc. But there's a sense in which we need to liberate the archive in order to see this country, South Africa, as it is. And what do I mean by that? I want to take you back to some of the early offerings of African nationalist thought in South Africa. I want to take you back to people like Silo Petema, some of the early Mandela. And I want to take you back to, Saul Plackett comes to mind here. I want to take you back to what they were trying to offer. And that was a pragmatic nationalism that didn't take race as a given. Right? A pragmatic nationalism that took South Africa as it was, not as they wished it to be. There's this famous point that Liberating makes at one point, that yes, I'm indigenous, right? But this should not, in some ways, determine, some sort of cue about who's a belonger and who's not a belonger. Right, that we all can belong to this polity, that we all can become South African. Why is this important? This is important, because I can't think of a better way of challenging the nativist nonsense that's been coming out of South Africa in the past few years, especially, where people who are classified African, never have to explain what it means for them to be South African, whereas everyone else. So if you classify colored, if you classified Indian, if you classified white, and of course I'm using the old apartheid terminology here, you always have to explain what makes you South African. And this is a fundamental misreading, I think, of this early nationalist strain, where African nationalists were trying to take seriously what it meant to be present in the making of South Africa as a country. So Selopetema has another piece in which he talks about the literal building of Pretoria. Right? He says, I was here when there was just open veld. Right? So I can testify to the construction of Pretoria as a city. Right? And he makes his point as a reminder that, there's always been a Black presence, right, in the making of South Africa. There's always been a Black presence in the construction of South Africa as a polity. And that, this presence has to be taken seriously, has to be taken literally, so that, we don't go back to these ideas that this was a white man's country, but that now for us to redress past wrongs, we have to make it a Black man's country, right, to use, some of the corrupt terminology. And I think this is important. And how does this connect to Mandela? It connects to Mandela in the sense that, when Mandela came out of prison, I was relatively young, but I was among those who always took issue with Mandela's take on non-racialism, as those of us who grew up in the Congress movement and in the UDF had come to understand it. Right? Mandela had this very pragmatic, but also very mechanical appreciation of race and non-racialism. Recall Mandela's disappointment when the Western Cape went for the National Party in the '94 election. Recall the campaign leading up to that election, where Mandela would literally trot out his colored comrades, right, and say, "Here's Trevor Manuel. What's your problem?" Right? Would trot out, Ahmed Kathrada as a way of explaining his non-racism, right? That some of my best friends are Indian, some of my best friends are colored. So what is your problem? Why can't you see that? And at the time, people of my generation, I think, saw this as crude. We saw this as a poor appreciation of non-racism as a practice, but also as a principle. But looking back, and of course, looking back, through the nonsense that's been created by the nativism represented, most reprehensibly by the EFF, I think there's something to be said for that appreciation of race and non-racism that Mandela embodied and tried to personify. And this actually makes me think of a point that Paul Gilroy makes in his book, Post-Colonial Melancholia, where he calls for what he describes as convivial indifference. Right? This is a conviviality that is open to race, that is open to difference, right? But isn't different in its appreciation of that. And this, and hopefully, is my way into the point I was trying to make earlier about how liberating the archive means going back to some of these early ideas about what South Africa was, or about what South Africa could be. Right, and finding intimations of this convivial indifference, right? That we can all be South African without having to create a queue about who belongs more than than others. That we can imagine a South Africa that is founded on what is present in the country. Right, so presence then becomes a politics that then allows for one to claim, voice in the public sphere, for one to claim membership, of this polity. So this might sound counterintuitive, but I think it is important, and it's important, because it alerts us to I think the naked construction of a South Africa as we'd like to imagine it, right? Of a South Africa that somehow emerged organically, and then all these other races came in, into the picture, and then suddenly there was a problem, and now we have to try and figure this out, right? And the point that I want to make very crudely is that there were no Black South Africans who emerged automatically. Right, that people had to fight, people had to try and negotiate what it meant for them to be South African, to become South African, right? So South Africa, which actually it always goes back to some of what we're trying to do with this pre-colonial archive, that South Africa had no freestanding existence, prior to say 1910, if we want to take that as our cutoff point, or certainly before 1994. Right. So this idea that there was this organic place and that we can somehow go back to some ideal and some idyllic past is problematic, and it's something that we need to challenge. And I think we can challenge that by taking seriously this idea of liberating the archive. So going back to what Saul Blakey has to say about what it means for him to become a pariah, but also what it means, for him to make the argument that I've become a pariah in the land of my birth. Right, when what he's trying to do is to fight for equality, right, as a South African, right? What he's trying to do is to make the claim that he has as much claim to being a South African as did Jan Smuts at the time, right? So that's the one point I wish to make. And then the other point that I would like to make has to do in a much more narrow sense with the archive and the place of the archive in public discourse. And that is what I'd like to, these aren't my words, but I'm going to use them anyway. What I'd like to call ethics of care and an ethics of responsibility. And the question I have here is a very narrow question, and that is, where does my care, where does my responsibility lie? When what I'm trying to do is to use the apartheid archive, more specifically the apartheid security archive, to try and unravel some of these secrets of the past, right? To whom should I be responsible? Is it the archivists, and some of them are present here today, who helped me get access to this material, or is it the Crime Intelligence Division, which is now what the security police is called, that is responsible for this archive? Right. So which protocols do I go by? Right. And this is a problem that confronts me in a real sense, because I have material in the terrorist album that I needed to get declassified. But it wasn't clear to me. I mean, I followed the procedure and I followed the protocols, but it wasn't clear to me if this was necessary. Right. I mean, legally it was necessary because that's what the law says. But I wasn't sure if ethically this was the right thing to do. And so it made more sense, for me to ask the family, of the affected person for permission to use the material, right? And of course, what I had to confront was the possibility that, while the family might say yes, and thankfully the family did say yes, the crime intelligence people might say no. Then what do I do then? Do I go ahead and use the material? Or do I have to respect the law and respect, crime intelligence and not use the material? And I think there's a real question because, we're now discovering, those of us who work with the Apartheid Security Archive, that there's a lot more material than was destroyed, still out there. Right, that a lot of this Apartheid Security Archive actually survived. It survived in the National Archives, it survived in departmental archives, it survived in people's garages, it survived in people's storerooms, right? And it's now coming out in drips and drabs. And as we're discovering, and of course the Mandela Foundation knows this, it's now coming out in very instrumental ways, but also in very cynical ways, right? Where people know they have this material, but they know that they're the only ones who have this material, and are using it in some ways to muddy the waters, right? To use a metaphor, but also using it to shape discourse, right? So think of the power, right? So think of the valence that the slur collaborator has in South Africa. But also think of the instances where, when that's been used, what evidence has been marshaled to support the slur, right? And this is what prompts me to ask this question about ethics of care and ethics of responsibility. So am I responsible to crime intelligence people, should I follow the law when it looks to me like the law is actually not helping? When it looks to me like the law has become yet another layer preventing a full confrontation with the archive narrowly defined. That's the question that I want to ask, and I hope we will have some thoughts on this one. And then the last point is connected to the point I made earlier. This has to do with the work that Carolyn has been trying to do, with Mbongiseni Buthelezi and other colleagues, recuperating the pre-colonial archive, and this is more feeling than thought. So just take my response, once it comes. And I have a feeling that the key trouble with this search for the pre-colonial archive and how we might bring into the present is one of temporality, right? That I think for us to assume that there is this pre-colonial archive, we have to assume that there are different levels of temporality, right? And that the pre-colonial archive operated on a different level to what we might call the modern, temporality that shapes us as South Africans, right? And the trouble I see with this is not just that it assumes multiple temporalities, but also that in some ways it casts Africans by definition, right? And I'm going to use a crude apartheid categories here. It casts Africans by definition as specialists, right? As those that somehow have this intrinsic ability or have this capability to access this pre-colonial archive. Right, and you look at some of the calls that a number of historians have been making, over the years. In fact, you can push us back to John Dube, as early as 1919, making the claim that if only there were enough Black historians in South Africa, the history would be different. Right, it's never been clear to me how different the history would be. Right, it's never been clear to me that if we train more Black historians, somehow we would come up with better histories. Right, we might have a richer archive. We might have a richer, source base to work from because people are coming with different languages, right? But beyond that, it's not obvious to me, right? It's not obvious to me that, a Black historian broadly defined, right, has some special access that might allow us to recuperate these pre-colonial archives, right? How do we get around this problem? How do we, because of course there is something in the past. I'm not dismissing this and I'm not disputing it. There's certainly something in the past, but how do we get at that? I think we get at that by taking seriously that the encounter that comes to define South Africa, starting in the 1500s, right? The region that becomes South Africa later on, starting in the 1500s, that encounter, automatically collapses, right? Whatever notions of temporality people might have had, and that what we're working with is one train of history, right? Broadly defined. It has no particular direction. It's not driven by any telos, and that for us to try and search for this pre-colonial archive as a way of bringing it into the present means taking seriously the fact that we will have Africans with last names Van Wyk, that we will have Africans with last names Smith, right, who have as much authority, right, to talk about what this archive might tell us, right, as we might have people who trace their origins to the subcontinent or to Europe. Right, so that the search for pre-colonial archives is not some innocent search for some pristine past uncontaminated by the present, but something messier, something much more complex, but more importantly, something that doesn't have answers. Right, that we shouldn't assume that if we get this pre-colonial archive and bring it into the present, that it will tell us what we need it to tell us, that we don't know what might be in there. That we have intimations, we have some sense of what might be in there, but we can't say for sure that we know what this pre-colonial archive has, and we need to bring that into the present. I want to stop there, but thank you.
Jacob, thank you very much. We move to you now, Imran. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Can you hear me? Good. Actually, a manuscript I'm working on, I've just about completed. This question of missing archives is very central to the Bisson case. And even the Bisson court transcripts take a long time to track down. So a lot of modern transcripts and archives that we haven't accessed and people haven't read properly. But let me talk about Mandela. For me, the most interesting interpretive problem with Mandela is that he's a figure of both violence and non-violence. And historically, if you think about it, there are almost no models for such a figure, except perhaps Abraham Lincoln, someone who's associated with the use of the sword, but also with the reduction of violence and the turning away from violence. There's one character in literature who resembles this, who's kind of a general of non-violence as well as violence, and it is General Kutuzov, Field Marshal Kutuzov, who is in some ways the principal character of War and Peace. And it turns out that Kutuzov is the one literary character that Mandela talks about in his correspondence and with Richard Stengel. So Mandela is a kind of fascinating figure of violence and non-violence at the same time. And I think we have yet to come to terms of what that means, both about violence and non-violence. The simplest way I can think about to do it is to look at the genealogy of non-violence that Mandela is involved in. Now, Leo Tolstoy was the most important figure of non-violence in the 19th century, by far more important than numerically than, say, Thoreau or Emerson. And that was the fact that brought him into touch with Gandhi in 1909, right? The last serious correspondence of Tolstoy's life was with Gandhi in 1909. Tolstoy was very attracted by the idea that at the ends of the earth, as he saw it, his ideas were being carried out by Gandhi. And Gandhi, on the other hand, was very attracted by Tolstoy, not by his writing, but by the idea that Tolstoy was someone who had actually put his doctrine into practice, right? Gandhi talks about Tolstoy as a millionaire who lives a kind of austere lifestyle. And I always think of that as quite a Gujarati way of thinking. On the one hand, he's very impressed by Tolstoy being a millionaire. On the other hand, he's even more impressed by his personal austerity. Okay? Gandhi was interested in only two of Tolstoy's stories that we can find out. One of them is called Ivan the Fool, and Ivan is one of three brothers, four siblings, and he is the innocent, naive, simple one who always, plays well with people, does good to people, and he rises to be Tsar of Russia. And he is unusual because in his kingdom, people with calloused hands, people who don't have the pale hands of someone who've never worked, people who've worked with their hands are given pride of place in the kingdom. And 3 days before Gandhi was assassinated, people said, well, how can you be sure that India is going to be a non-violent state? And he said, well, when Ivan the Fool became Tsar, he continued to be non-violent, and so India will continue to be non-violent as well. Something that we as South Africans know is that Mandela inherited or was associated with a good deal of the machinery of Gandhian organization, right? Obviously through the Defiance campaign, the legacy of civil disobedience. We probably haven't thought enough about the fact that Mandela's, what I think of is probably his longest statement of doctrine in 1993 is actually about the Gandhian inheritance, what he derived from it, and Gandhian radicalism. On topics as, it's very unusual to have someone about to assume office in the middle of an extremely violent crisis who talks about how Gandhi teaches us to think about sex, how Gandhi teaches us to think not about strife between the classes, but about harmony between the classes. So in 1993 and again in 1999, Mandela turned to Gandhi to write, to kind of express his own kind of radicalism. Mandela, I think we could say, internalized Gandhi in the same way that Gandhi internalized Muslim and Sikh religious figures and Muslim and Sikh religious traditions, almost as a way of being closer to the Indian community. Right? And similarly, he internalized Tolstoy in all kinds of unexpected ways. War and Peace should have been removed from the Robben Island Library because it had the word war in the title. The jailers had gone through and taken out all the books, including war, including H.G. Wells' science fiction novel, War of the Worlds. But they left War and Peace in the library by accident. And when Gandhi got into trouble, when Mandela got into trouble for writing his autobiography with Mac Maharaj, he had a lot more time to read, but he couldn't read his law books anymore. And War and Peace is one of the books he turned to. And General Kutuzov is the one person he remembered from that book. And Kutuzov, as Tolstoy tells us, is an amazing figure because he devotes his energy as a general to sparing life, to providing mercy, to ending conflicts. The French army is falling apart in its own right during the 1812 invasion. And Kutuzov, because he expresses the national spirit of his people, can restrain violence. So I think that's why he's so important to Mandela. Now, those are they're kind of literal links that they have in common, right? Reading one another, Gandhi reading Tolstoy or Mandela reading Tolstoy and inheriting Gandhi's forms of organization. But what do they substantively have in common? And I'd say the first and most important thing is probably that they are all figures that we associate with manual labor, right? When we think about Tolstoy, we think about him making his own sandals, doing his own laundry. When we think about Tolstoy and Gandhi, remember that they were quite absorbed by this issue of doing the kind of cleaning their own chamber pots. And Mandela, we know that he folded his own pajamas every day. He, instead of allowing his jailers at the end of his term on Robben Island to wash the dishes, he would wash the dishes. Even when he was president, there's an example when he stayed in a fancy hotel in Shanghai. And every morning when the workers went in to clean up the room, Mandela had already made his bed. And the workers were very upset. So, they said, we see this as a reflection on our work. And so Mandela called them in and he explained to them why he believed that he had to make his own bed, right? So manual labor is a very important thing that they share in common. We can talk about why. Second thing they share in common is an amazing openness to children and to animals wherever possible. The third thing they have in common is that they constructed a collective identity or patriotism. I think Jacob and Carolyn's referred to this. They constructed collective identities purified of antagonism, right? Which is also an absolutely extraordinary achievement in the 20th century or in the 21st century, right? To have these enormous conglomerations of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, which are not directed in enmity towards any other collective organization or other state. Okay. In fact, they're kind of figures of a general peace. And the amazing thing about Mandela is, in his case, even violence was purified of the kind of inherent antagonism and tendency to escalation that violence usually brings. Okay. I think probably the next most important thing that they share is the desire to not be complicit, or another way to put it is a drive to self-improvement, right? Which goes alongside a drive to collective improvement. Tolstoy put it very severely. He said, I am an accessory in every kind of injustice or inequality, in a constantly repeated crime of inequality, as long as I have superfluous food and anyone else has none at all, as long as I have 2 garments while anyone else has even 1. And so he had extreme standards for himself, but extreme standards for what would count as social change. Gandhi similarly had a kind of drive to self-improvement through politics. In a 1918 letter, he said, I was only in the political life because through the political life lay my own liberation. I don't think Mandela would put it quite the same way, but I think there's a similar convergence of this intense drive towards moral improvement, towards self-improvement. Okay. That's the first half of what I was going to say, if I'm not taking up too much time. The second half was to talk about archives in particular. What do you gain by going through the 110 volumes of Gandhi's collected correspondence, letters, through Mandela's letters, and so forth? Well, the first thing you gain is a kind of day-by-day realistic sense of how a life evolves, how its thinking evolves. In Gandhi's case, by the way, very slowly and tendentiously, right? But also a feeling for these moments of sudden transcendence or sudden insight or changes of perspective, where their amazing originality came from. And I'm just going to give you an example or two each for Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Mandela. Here's Tolstoy's diary in 1881. He says, it's springtime in Russia. I assume it's spring in Russia for a few days every year. And he says, bells ring and guns fire. People are learning to kill. Right? Soldiers are training, but the sun shines warm and bright again. The streams flow, the earth thaws, and God again says, live happily. Right? So in a single moment, Tolstoy can kind of understand that nonviolence and violence, cooperation and antagonism, right, the state and civil society, all together without judging, almost objectively or impersonally. Okay? For Gandhi, I'd like to read you a short that he was involved in. He said, I'll read this letter lastly, and we can go back to Mandela in a minute. He said, I've made it my profession in life to break up homes. I think he's thinking of Thoreau's ideas of furniture and homes. I've made it my profession to break up homes, and I felt no wrench in my heart at any time while doing so. I started doing this in the year 1891, and ever since then I've been doing nothing but that. He says, I set up a home in Bombay and I broke it up. I did the same thing in Rajkot, I broke it up. I went to Bombay at a mere suggestion. Right? He says, I went to South Africa accompanied by some youths who cared to come with me. There was the same story there. I cannot tell how much money I must have wasted on furniture, but I do not remember ever feeling a wrench in the heart in all these wild adventures. So I think if there's a guiding problem for Mandela, it's this question of how can non-violence coexist with violence. If there's a guiding problem for Gandhi that you see from the archives, it's how can somebody who incarnated the largest collective identity or second largest collective identity of the 20th century, right? The state of India. How is it that he presented himself as an individualist, almost as a libertarian who made his decisions by absolute whim? Do I have time for a line or two from Mandela on getting old?
Yeah, Imran, if you're wrapping up now, that would be great.
All right. Here's one short letter from Mandela, which will be useful to all of those of us who are getting old, which I also found in his letters. And he wrote it to Fatima Mir. And I think it's a kind of disguised form of autobiography, but it's also a way of approaching what it means to die. He says, for decades, he's talking about Fatima Mir's mother, I assume, Granny Nick. For decades, she has traveled up and down with nose always on the ground, like a keen-scented bloodhound. She keeps to the beaten track, but has hardly ever failed to muster the initiative to open up a new path whenever a blind alley looms ahead. By now, she should know every stream in Natal, every valley, hill, hole, and blade of grass. So I think that's Mandela's image or self-presentation of what it means to grow old, and especially what it means to grow old in this radical tradition of evolving wisdom and nonviolence. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Imran. And I'm sure everyone will agree we've had some really thought-provoking inputs. I want to circle back to Carolyn initially. Carolyn, just to ask you, do you want to respond to either Jacob or Imran in terms of what you've heard from them? I do have a question for you myself, and maybe I just name it. And if you're seeing anything in the chat space that you'd like to respond to. But the question for me to you has to do with this role of archive and public life in the context of these, what I think of as archival juggernauts, Google and Facebook and so on. I know you've read Surveillance Capitalism by Zuboff. Does this shift the role of archive and public life for you? And I remember talking to you about Fees Must Fall and the extent to which students were using these juggernauts, Facebook and so on, WhatsApp, as mobilizing tools, as instruments for their struggle. But the ways in which those instruments were invaded by security and then used against the student formations, and archive playing a critical role in all of that. So that would be my line of inquiry for you. But if you want to first engage with Jacob and Imran, over to you.
I'll start with the temporal question that I thought Jacob really tabled fantastically, because it would certainly follow from my argument, which suggests that we're being obliged by a Euro-American theoretical inheritance to think of archive in a particular way. And that way, part of that 19th century concept lies in the idea that the good archive is the archive that is the eyewitness to the event. In other words, it's the document from the time which is then preserved, well preserved. So that is the reliable archive, even if it's biased. It could reflect a very biased point of view, but at least it reflects the bias accurately, the assumption is, because it's recorded at that particular time. And so the so-called pre-colonial is created as a place of absence, an absence of archive. It lacks archive because it lacks the thing which is conserved at the moment, right? But of course, if you go back, and there'll be others who will sort of have to correct me here, because I'm not a scholar of the pre-modern in Europe and so on. But if you look at the archives of the churches and so on, it's well understood that the documents that are conserved in those archives are copies of documents and interpretations. And so no one imagines that they are, except in exceptional circumstances, an actual thing that dates back to, say, classical Rome or Greece, right? It's fully understood that these are changing things. And the argument that I make about the archive that we have inherited as not being inert tells you, if I'm right, that the lack that is visited by the concept itself upon the so-called pre-colonial is in fact as much an issue for the document which appears to be simply the witness to the event at the very moment. So, of course, the kinds of changes that are involved are entirely different in different circumstances. That's why every item requires an attentiveness to its own biography, because it has moved through time doing things and having things done to it. And that's different from writing a history even of that archival, the item that's been made archival. Because a history is often about the significance of a thing at a particular time. But a biography, the biography, you can't resist, given the presence of Rhodes in all these discussions, you can't resist to use the biography of Rhodes as the example. The biography of Rhodes is interested in Rhodes to understand how the times made the man and how the man made the times, and how that has continued to be contested and rethought through time, with the result that we constantly find and rethink the archives that are involved. It also goes to the point that Imran makes about, well, what does it mean to read the full archive and to read deeply and to read widely, or what Jacob does, which is to switch around and find other things, other archives, and to understand them too, not as constants, but as things themselves that change. And you see that so beautifully in that chapter on Lumka Yengeni. I think it really comes out vividly there. So I want to make that point really fundamentally, that we have to challenge the theoretical apparatus that is thrust upon us where we can and how we can. And I suppose that the Babel and Baum book also truly attempts to challenge in new ways the way in which the notion of the public sphere is visited upon us. Because as we go back to think, as Jacob has asked us to do, about someone like Saul Plaatje participating in public life, the question of whether it's best understood as a public sphere from which Black intellectuals and thinkers are excluded, or whether we were trying to understand how something like webs of being able to enter in discussion are actually making sure that some of those discussions are coming into public life. This is all conceptual challenge, especially for, I want to say, the young scholars who are with us today, to say there's a lot of room here for some big rethinking. We shouldn't take the theoretical apparatus for granted. On the juggernauts question, Vern, on the one hand, of course, what we are seeing today is different and new. But one of the things that that Babel book is trying to argue is that when you take a long historical view, while scales might be different, the way in which the human species uses ideas about the past and decides that certain things are the archives for the past doesn't change a hell of a lot over history. It changes in scale, it changes in particular plans, but we're often doing much the same thing, whether we are, in Mongol dominance of China, back in the day, or whether we are in Europe with the Catholic Church, or whether we're in Tibet with the question of what Buddhist text coming over the Himalayas means. This is all, it's always very much a similar set of human processes Scale, medium, technology, all of that differs. But the power struggles don't differ much. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn. Jacob, I'm looking at you now. Not sure if you would want to respond to Carolyn or Imran, but I have a question for you, and it has to do with what you called ethics of care and responsibility. And reading your book, I was reminded of my own experiences when I was working in the TRC investigation and reading these intelligence files, security police files, and so on. And the question has to do with that boundary between public space and private space. I mean, did you have the sense of invading private space? What do you do in that space?
I certainly did. If I sound slow, it's because I'm processing all these rich insights. I certainly did. So I have a chapter, and I won't say what chapter this is, but I have a chapter where, upon reading the security police files, and I mean, this is in some ways, this is gold, right? Because these are, so these are the files we were told have been destroyed. So these are the files that have informer reports, like verbatim informer reports, written informer reports. That stuff is out there. That stuff exists, right? And I was reading, some of this material, and it was pretty clear, and of course you have to be suspicious. I mean, this is one of the many lessons I take from Carolyn's work on archive, yours too, Vern, on archive and archival practice, right? That you have to read this suspiciously, that you can never ever trust the archive, however defined. But upon reading this material, it was pretty clear that one of the informers was actually a close friend. In fact, there are two instances that one of the informers was actually a close friend of the so-called target, and that the other, informer was a relative. And it was pretty obvious from just working out, how the material worked and how it connected to other bits of evidence. And that certainly felt like a violation, right? And here I am in 2020, coming out of the book that takes you back to the 1970s. And of course, if you have a good memory and are able to think back to where you were, so in northern Natal, to use your terminology, in March of say 1977, right? It's not going to take you long to work out who the informer was, right? And so that certainly felt like a violation. And then there's another chapter where, in fact, there are two chapters in my book where the father is actually the ones informing on the sons, right? So in the one case, there is a confrontation later on. So this is Eric Abraham, who actually confronts his father, and there's a BBC documentary, about the confrontation, for those of you who are interested. Where he goes back, so he lives in England now, but he comes back to the father in Cape Town and says, "Why did you do this?" And, the father says, well, coming out of the Holocaust in Central Europe, right, surviving that experience, my key concern was seeing to it that we were not victimized in South Africa. And so I worked with these people to protect you, right? We might question that, I certainly question, the motivation. But so there is that confrontation. So that, is for Eric and his father to deal with. But then there's another instance where, we have records, we have payment slips that show the father receiving, money, from the security police in Krugersdorp for informing on one of his sons, right? And there, the father dies before there is a confrontation. But you talk to the family now, there are people who say, well, of course, the old man loved money, so that's not surprising. And then there are other people who say, well, no, it can't be. Can't be. What father would do that to his son, right? And you're sitting there, right, in the middle of this, group interview with members of the family, and the family are going at one another, and it's pretty clear that, you've come in and put poison, right, in the family waters. So that is something that I've had to think about. But I also thought it important to tell that story because, many things trouble me, right? I guess I'm obsessive that way. But one of the things that trouble me, I think, the most is this, notion of Black innocence that always attends how we think about Black history, broadly defined in South Africa, right? That we're all victims, that we're all just poor skepsels, right? If but for this, we would have been, different. And I'm drawn to these stories that complicate that in the most direct way possible. Stories that say to us, well, actually, no. No, we're not all victims and we're not all innocent. And that for us too, in some ways, rebuild the social contract. I think we have to confront this past, where what made apartheid possible was Black collaboration. Right. So that I think is something that I want to put out there. And I just want to, I'm a quick response because I want to, hear what others say. And there's so much here that I can only respond to just some of the points. The point you make about the suspicion of Black historians is well, is well made and it is well taken. I don't share that suspicion. I don't share that suspicion. I think there's something for us to puzzle over, right? And that's the fact that professional history in South Africa is dominated by, white historians, right? Or people classified white, right? But what this means in practice, right? What this means ideologically, I think it's something that we can't just assume we know. We have to think through what this means, right? At the same time, we also have to think through what, calling for more Black historians to be trained, what that itself means, right? And it has to mean that we get rid of these easy assumptions about what Blackness means. We have to get rid of these easy assumptions that we can naturalize Blackness, to a point where we can, know, even before a Black historian speaks, what they're going to say, because we don't know that. So that's some of what I want to say. But I think your point is well taken. To finish with Mao, right? Let what was it, like 1,000 flowers bloom or whatever that is, right? We certainly need way more historians because there are many stories to be told. But I think what we need to do is in some ways to cut race down to analytical size, right? To stop letting race do all the work for us, because I think that's what we do, and I find that lazy, right? So that's where I want to stop for now.
Jacob, thank you. I'm going to ask you and Carolyn both to just have a look at what's in the chat space and the Q&A space. There are questions for the two of you. But I want to go back to Imran. Jacob, your book, it's not an easy book to read, right? And that has a lot to do with the extent to which it's about torture, literal and other forms of torture. But Imran, I want to ask you, because you, in your book, you juxtapose the violence which was used by Madiba in the early stages of the armed struggle. And Jacob, I'm looking back at you because I remember when you engaged at the Nelson Mandela Foundation in 2011 around this question of the use of violence and how it changed over time. So Imran, to you, I mean, the different mode, the different approach to violence which Mum Winnie represents, and her experiences of torture, the role that played in how she responded to the violence of the state and her own use and sanction of violence. Wondering if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, well, that's clearly the most living issue for many people. How do we judge Winnie Mandela and what she did? I think we should probably, and what I say in the book is, maybe we should turn the question around and go back about the 1960s. He said the thing about it was we were fighting a gentleman's war. There was a kind of, clearly not true, but there was the possibility of honor on both sides. Most people on both sides were men, overwhelmingly men, right? And Mandela in particular was in a situation on Robben Island where there are certain kinds of brutalities that weren't inflicted on him, right? Winnie's experience was very different. And I think, look, we all have our personal feelings about Winnie, but I think let's ask the question, what would it mean for an ethic of nonviolence or reduction of violence to apply to Winnie in the same way that it did to Nelson Mandela, right? What were her options? Can nonviolence as an ethic reach beyond a certain kind of privileged fear? You know, or could Mandela's reliance on honor, you know, he would constantly try and build these bonds of honor with his jailers, right? Even with P.W. Botha, of all people, and Pik Botha, right? Can that strategy, is that strategy conceivable for Winnie? And my guess is, I think probably most of us, once we put it that way, we'd answer no. And I think the deeper question here is, what Mandela found in War and Peace is an anti-intentionalist view of violence, right? So for Tolstoy and for Kutuzov, the Russian commander, there was no need to intentionally set up a battle. There was no need to force confrontation. He said violence kind of happens along the trail. You know, partisans pick off the French troops as instinctively as a wolf, you know, wipes out, eats, whatever it happens to be. You know, violence is entirely naturalized and outside the hands of a commander and outside the hands of military authority, which is actually a very convincing account of the 1812 campaign. And I think similarly, Mandela might say, if he were to be completely articulate about his view of violence, it would be violence is continuing whatever I do, right? Necklacing is continuing, guerrilla violence, insurgency, right? So it's not, my place is almost not to command that violence, but to understand it as part of an entirely naturalized landscape of action. And I think maybe with Winnie, the more appropriate thing to say is, you know, how was her action as a woman, as a defiant person, as someone from a relatively privileged family, how did that play out in her life? And I think to that extent, there's some agreement we can come to on what the facts are and what happened, and also particularly about the limits of nonviolence. Yeah?
Imran, thank you. Jacob, I'm wanting to circle back to you. Do you want to come in on that? Otherwise, I'd go to Carolyn in terms of some of the questions that are being posed.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just quickly, So the question that came to mind, you know, when I was reading, you know, Imran's new book, was the the relationship between means and ends, right? The extent to which you know, violence is for Mandela clearly you know, a means to something else, right? And the, you know, if looked at another way, and the extent to which you know, violence is always an end in itself, right? And I'm thinking of the ways in which, you know, violence always assumes a life of its own, right? In that sense, it's a lot like fire. That you know, humans think that we've domesticated fire, but it's actually a transactional relationship, right? That there's a limit to how far we can claim that we have domesticated fire, you know, as a species. Because it always has this life of its own. And I think you know, without overdoing this, I think we can think of violence the same way. And that what we see, in fact, in South Africa, right, is what starts out as a pragmatic attempt on Mandela's part, you know, as I see it, to use violence instrumentally, right, to make the other side listen, but they quickly lose control. You know, because like a fire, that it has a life of its own, and in some ways, I think that's what we're paying for. But of course, to make sense of this, you know, we have to push it all the way back, you know, to the migrant labor system. I don't think it starts with them, or with Mandela's generation. That's the one point to make, and then the other point, you know. And this has to do with Winnie and how we understand her. And I think there's something to be said here for the connection between violence and corruption. There's something to be said here for the connection between, you know, the HIV/AIDS pandemic and what that does to how one thinks about mortality and how one thinks about death, and the corruption we see in South Africa. I think there's full frontal confrontation that many people have with death, like, and its imminence, because of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, I think can help explain the fraying of the social fabric, right? I think can help explain the shamelessness, can help explain the recklessness with which you know, people live their lives, especially in the public sphere. And I don't know if we've made those connections strongly enough in the past. And just to illustrate this, so I agree, you know, fully that to understand what happens to Winnie, the recklessness, the abandon, that we have to understand what happens to her in solitary confinement, right? We have to understand what happens to her under torture. I've been warned against using the language of the torturer. So we shouldn't be saying people are broken, right? But I think what happens to her in detention helps explain why she doesn't care, later on. Like, what more can they do to her short of killing, right? I think it's an important question, that we have to think about. Tony Yangain is another one. Right, Tony Yangain. In some ways, the iconic image we have coming out of the Truth Commission, like not the iconic sound, because that comes from Mrs. Kalata, but I think the iconic image we have is of Jeffrey Benzine, showing us how he made Tony Yangain poop himself, literally, right? And Tony Yangain never came back from that experience. And this, I think, helps explain the later context. Like, it helps explain the lack of shame, etc., etc. And so part of what I think we have to do as South Africans is acknowledge the violence done to bodies, like acknowledge the deep, deep violence that destroyed many people, and see the connections between that and the society that we live in, in the present.
Jacob, just quickly, I'm looking at a question that's been posed in the chat space around informers' reports in intelligence files. I wondered if you just wanted to speak to that one quickly. You made the point that informers get paid, so it's in their interest to provide information. How reliable is that information?
Sorry, yeah. It's how reliable is it? I don't think it's reliable, right? So I don't think that should be the test. I don't think that's how we should approach informer reports, right? Is this reliable or is this not reliable, right? I don't think that should be the test, right? The test should be, how does this connect to other bits of evidence that I have, right? How does this help make sense of the story I'm trying to tell, right? I think that's the measure. It has to be the measure because the other, because the alternative, I think, is to do what people are doing with claims that so-and-so was an informer, so-and-so was was not an informer. And that is to read these documents transparently, right? To look at a code and say, okay, that is so-and-so, and that therefore, settles the question. No, it doesn't work that way. Right? It doesn't work that way, right? We tell our students to always write in the active voice, right? Try reading some of these informer reports. Try reading some of these police reports. It's so secretious, it's so convoluted, right? But that's part of the plan, right? That you have to read it with a great deal of care. So you don't read it for reliability, but you read it for connection. Right? So how is this connected to that other point? Because I think I'll be the last person to make the suggestion that we need to be running into the archives to find out who the informers were. That should not be, what interests us. Of course, informers, official informers were paid, but not every informer was paid. Right? This is something also we have to, keep in mind. We also have to keep in mind the corruption of the police themselves. Right? That they would oftentimes make up stories, or there would be people, so they would engage in conversation innocently. Right? And you don't know that you're talking to a security police officer, and then that becomes a report, right? And that so-and-so told me this, right? Because the police officer has to say where the information came from, right? So we have to always read these documents with a great deal of care and a great deal of suspicion, and we can't read them for reliability. I hope this is helpful.
No, thank you, Jacob. I'm looking at the watch here, and we're beginning to draw to a close. We've got 10 minutes left. I'm wanting to offer each of the three panelists, space to offer final reflections. Carolyn, you haven't spoken for quite a while. I'm going to circle back to you first. Please use the space in whatever way you like. If you want to respond to questions that have been posted or take a different line.
Thanks very much, Vern. I think I'll probably go back to those three lines of inquiry that you raised right at the beginning. And you asked about what's the mooring of nonviolence. And I really want to draw attention to a line in Imran's book. It's quite near the beginning, where he says non-violence was a counter-technology of its own, fashioned by Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr., and transmitted by letter and doctrine, collective memory, and the force of example. And I was very struck by that, and I think it's I don't want us to lose that, because I think it's one of the answers to those big opening questions that you put there. And it sort of allows me obliquely to look at the question that Khalil has put in the Q&A. I don't know if all the participants see the questions. It's about really the way in which you get lots of mediated, unmediated forms of media that flow in public life today. And I was looking at a question and thinking, oh, well, I could give an answer here and so on. But what I really wanted was to be able to give my slot to my co-editor, Leslie Cowling, because actually in this book, it's a double-handed thing, because we're talking about public discourse all the time in relation to archive and media. And the double-handedness, and in fact, the collaboration of the entire group of people who do that, who work together to put that book together, I think is critical when you want to break out of a silo of thinking. Because in this, we're all sort of trained and orientated to think within a particular silo. And somehow the world tells us, well, if you behave and if you work in a transdisciplinary way, that will get you out of the silo. But that often means sort of being the animal specialist and then getting the botanist to do the botany bit of your study. But actually to try to work together with others, where perspectives from other places disrupt your own assumptions, becomes absolutely crucial. What I'm trying to say is that in the answer to those big three questions that you posed, I have a sense that we have to think differently, incredibly differently. And thinking, what are the conditions of thinking differently? That is a very tricky question. And I suppose I would want to argue that one of the conditions of thinking differently is listening differently, hearing things differently, being able to work within, being forced to bring insights from one place into a critical tension with insights with another place. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm circling back to you, Imran. Just to say, you know, I bought your book at the same time as I bought Judith Butler's. And I just want to do one quote from her book where she says, the question of nonviolence is a question precisely when violent resistance seems the only option. And, you know, I bought these books, I read these books because it seems to me that we're in a space where violence for too many people seems to be the only option.
That is true. I wrote my PhD on Adam Smith, actually, surprisingly. And somewhere he says the most mistaken sentence Adam Smith ever said about the 21st century, which he never experienced, is that when you talk to other people, it relatively reduces your own feelings, right? So when you're upset about something, you talk about someone, it makes you less sad or less in pain. And obviously on social media, we see the opposite happening. We see people talking to other people with identical opinions. I think it's what Carolyn's talking about. And having their views reinforced. But the interesting thing about Gandhi and Mandela and Tolstoy is the first people they disagreed with were their own communities and collectivities. And they kind of internalized the idea of having a dialogue with somebody who actually disagreed with them, you know? I mean, and that's what we nowadays see to some extent as their weaknesses, right? The way in which Gandhi saw South Africa as a chance to kind of have a strange romance with the English, right? The way in which Mandela internalized colonial ideas, admired Jan Smuts and so forth. But actually, that is the only way you don't get these kind of reinforcing circles of collective antagonism and hostility. Right? Can I say one last thing? As actually one of the useful things about reading Jacob's book is that I had thought that all those archives were destroyed. And as I was finishing a piece on Vaughter-Besson, you know, Vaughter-Besson kept all these private archives as a form of insurance against getting caught later by a new government. And Jacob's book saved me from making this terrible mistake of thinking that actually all the archives were destroyed. But one of the things I realized I read through the 25,000 page trial transcript of Besson, the way that Besson was exonerated. The amazing thing to me was it was such a case of the judge Hartzenberg as an Afrikaans man talking to another Afrikaans man in an Afrikaans community, right? exactly the same way if you had a whole bunch of Indian Muslim writers all talking to each other, reinforcing each other, and completely overlooking the very obvious evidence that Vota Bassan had participated in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of killings. Right? So I think, practically speaking, if you want to ask what's the single best thing you can do in the world to make sure your politics don't go wrong, right? It's to open yourself up to the possibility of confrontation with other points of view, whether or not you agree with them, whether or not you have to go to war with them ultimately, as Mandela did or tried to do. But it's that confrontation that escapes this kind of fatal circle of rivalry and hostility that our world seems to be consumed by right now. Thank you.
Imran, thank you. So we only have a couple of minutes left. I want to hand back to Sylvia, but Jacob, any last reflection before I do that?
Yeah, this has been a very rich discussion, and I'm sure that we'll continue this. So thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, so I'm going to hand over to Sylvia now, just to say that for me, this conversation has illustrated the fundamental importance of archive. The Nelson Mandela Foundation is often asked, why are you obsessed by archive? And it's because it is potentially so liberating. It's a critical resource for making that liberatory future. So thank you to all three of the panelists from my side. Lots to think about, and we will continue pursuing these lines of inquiry at the foundation. I'm going to now hand over to my colleague, Sylvia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vern, and thank you to the panelists. I think everyone would agree with me that this has been a very rich conversation, a multi-layered discussion. And as I'm sitting here, I think it's also quite a privilege to include my voice in this discussion and reflect on a few things that came up for me. As what I call an almost born free, so I'm not a born free, but I was very close, and a student activist myself, I've always wondered about one portion of my activism, which was tagged by the hashtag Afrikaans must fall. And the reason why that particular protest within the institution that I studied in turned violent. And listening to Jacob Dlamini speak about Mama Winnie and the experiences that she had made me think deeper about Afrikaans must fall and the reasons why that particular protest turned violent and saw myself and other comrades arrested and facing criminal charges at the time. And today, I think I've come to a few answers, but obviously require more thinking and reading around that. And I just think that the violent nature of the institution and the institutional culture around Afrikaans, around those traditions, and what was being fought by students then really speaks to the violence that came through as a result. So I just really wanted to put that on the table from my perspective as an almost born free and as an activist myself. And with that, I'll take the time to just do a vote of thanks. Would like to thank the Hans Sadel Foundation for their continued support. We're really grateful for the work that you do with us at the Nelson Mandela Foundation and within the Dialogue program specifically. I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing your thoughts and your insights, and really, like I said, the different layers to this conversation have been quite insightful. Thank you, Carolyn Hamilton, Imran Kuvadia, and Jacob Dlamini. And to our outstanding facilitator, Dade Professor Vern Harris, it's always a privilege and we continue to learn from you. So thank you for the work that you've done this afternoon. And I'd also like to take the time to thank our colleagues at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Lee Davies, that supports us on the technical front, and Khalil Goga, who is the director of the Dialogue Department. To those that are joining us this afternoon, and that registered, you will be receiving a survey. We really would like to hear from you and ask that you fill out that survey for us and return it, as we do use that data in how we curate our dialogues. Thank you once again for joining us, and thank you for this conversation.